What's up, my ninjas, and welcome back to another episode of the Stateless Shinobi Podcast. Today we're going to be diving into a really complex topic, and like all things Stateless Shinobi, we're going to hit on politics, we're going to hit on history, we're going to hit on religion and philosophy, and really try and bring this topic home. That topic mainly being the complex relationship between Christianity as a religion, as a faith, as a historical actor, and the effect that it's had on slavery, or either the reinforcement or the disparagement that it has in slavery. That being said, like I said, this is a really complex topic. I hope you have enough time to stay with me. It is going to get a little deep, so if you're not with that, this channel is probably not for you. But with that, we're going to go ahead and dive right into it. Right before we do that, though, I'm going to get you to go ahead and hit that like button. Save, subscribe, do whatever you got to do, because we need to get this information out, not just to people who it's relevant to, but to the world, really. I really feel like this is something that everybody should have more context around, whether you spent your life in the church or, you're just not even really close to it. I think it's worth having a conversation and worth diving into the history and the effects of that history on our present day understanding and struggle. All of these things that we are going to tackle I feel have present day connotations and can give you a present day understanding of where we are at as a people, as a religion, as a society, really. So again, hit that like button and let's get into it. The topic for today, of course, is a little bit high-minded. I decided to title it Faith in Chains. Pretty much to decide and to discern the intersectionality between Christianity as a religion throughout history in its relation to slavery all the way up to the modern day slave trade. Well, not the modern day, but the 1800 slave trade that, me being American, has had a pretty big effect on our society and on the world even. Now, just to jump right in, I do want to say this isn't going to be a slam piece on Christianity. This isn't going to be a slam piece on, the religious tenets or anything like that. We're really just looking for, understanding and clarity when it comes to these conversations. And I know a whole lot of times I've seen, particularly African-American agnostics or atheists, they like to throw into the face of believers, Christianity supported slavery and, they had slaves in the Bible and stuff like that, and Christianity was just used to pacify and control slaves. And while that may be a bit of the story, I feel like it's really taken out of context and not given the larger level of understanding that something this complex really deserves. So with that being said, the first thing I sort of want to jump into, of course, is I do not in any effect believe that slavery in and of itself as a philosophy, as a religion, as a moral framework supports slavery. And I know that could be a little bit hard for some people to believe, but I feel like if you really are versed in the history and the understanding of what it all was going on in the Bible and the time period and the context, both post-text, pre-text, in order to give you, and subtext, in order to give you the context of what's going on, you'll recognize that. Of course, the Gospels, Jesus never explicitly condemns slavery, but if you take things within the context that are provided, he pretty much provides a challenge to the institution and the belief that masters and mistresses can own other people in the same way that a master or mistress can own a person or a piece of property. Oftentimes in the Gospels, the term servant is interchangeable for slave. But other parts of the New Testament also provide stronger support for Christians not to hold slaves. For instance, St. Paul chastised the Corinthians for allowing rich-poor divisions to enter the celebration of the Eucharist, or the, the communion. And many of the poor people that he was referring to was slaves. And this is something else that I think a lot of people don't understand within the historical context of the Bible, is that slavery has been with humanity as long as humanity has been around. And in that time, it was just a bulwark for the economy. It was a bulwark for society. It was a mainstay of Roman society. And that being said, in the early days of the Christian church, it was often seen as a religion of slaves and women, given that those were the most marginalized people in that society. And even though it may not have said it outright, it provided context and protections and understandings for those people that hitherto had never been established or never been brought to that level of society. And I think there's something really deep and beautiful about that, but we'll get into it a little bit more. I want to briefly go over the history and try and just bring into context everything that went on within the context of when the Gospels were written and as it followed and flowed through Europe all the way up to the 1800 slave trade, the triangle slave trade. So as I said before, slavery in ancient Rome was different from modern forms in a whole lot of ways, but it was similar as well. One of the main distinctions is that slavery in Rome was not based upon race. It was a common practice, but it was typically having to do with wartime or people selling themselves into slavery, things of that nature. And it wasn't something that was predicated on race like the 1800 slave trade. There were prisoners of wars, sailors captured and sold by pirates. And this is the world that Jesus came into, and this wasn't, it wasn't like there was a clean slate and Christianity introduced this paradigm. If anything, I feel like, it's just the world that he was born into. And taking that within context, I think we also have to recognize that while he didn't explicitly say, slaves are bad, he also gave tenets and religious beliefs that allowed you to know that, hey, if you connect the dots, if you want to push through and actually use your brain rather than just coast on what's explicitly said, then this practice is probably wrong. That being said, we're sort of going to fast forward through the Gospels. I don't want to turn this into a fully religious debate and hit on every scripture or anything like that. But, Jesus came, Jesus died, and the beginnings of the church were established. Like I said before, I referenced Corinthians. The apostles went out. They started different churches. And for a long time within the Roman Empire, Christianity was outlawed. Christianity was looked down on. You hear stories all the time about Christians being thrown to lions in the Colosseum and Christians being crucified. And this was a very real reality that that period of Christians were dealing with. And pretty much that was the mainstay of life as a Christian underneath the Roman Empire for a very long time, up into the rise of Constantine I, which was around 272 AD. So think about it, almost 300 years after Christ, Christians are still going through all this. And I know we've probably all heard of Constantine, very famous, very famous. There's also a great movie with Keanu Reeves that, no relation, but just if you haven't watched it, you should probably give it a watch. That being said, Constantine was a Roman emperor who legalized and made Christianity the state religion. A lot of people question the motivations behind that. There's a really great story about him being in battle with various other competitors for the throne, and him seeing a cross in the sun, and a voice or words telling him to paint the cross on his shield at a very pivotal battle. He eventually won that battle, and near the end of his life, he did convert. But even before he converted, he made Christianity the state religion. And during this time, there were a whole lot of separate sects of Christianity. You had Coptic, Orthodox, you had the Catholic Church that was just beginning. You had, churches spread all around the Mediterranean. And as a result of that spread, the doctrine that was being taught was very different. You had Arianism, you had a lot of other sort of beliefs. So one of the things that Constantine did, and I know it's a big buzzword for a lot of conspiracy theorists and everything else, and not to throw this word around as a disparagement, but non-believers, a lot of non-believers like to point out, there was the Council of Nicaea, the first Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And that was a council that was facilitated by Constantine. It had probably about 1,800 bishops or Christians from across the Roman Empire. And even with that, I still don't believe that was a full collection of all of the separate quote-unquote Christian beliefs that were going at the time. But during that time, they had to standardize, and this is when we went through what we call canonization, where some things were accepted into the Bible that we know today, and some things were thrown out. If you have any time, there are apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch. There are Gospels about Jesus as a child. And a lot of this stuff were mainstays of sects of Christianity prior to the Council of Nicaea, where all of that was standardized, some stuff was kicked out, and we pretty much came to the Bible that we had. One of the main things to come out of the Council of Nicaea was the Nicene sort of chant or the belief. And that belief is that we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. We believe that the Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son and God, eternally begotten from the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one in being with the Father. And while that sounds like, oh, that's Christianity, of course any Christian would agree upon that, we have to realize again that there were so many sects and so many disparagements in these beliefs. There were sects of Christians who believed that Jesus was a man. There were sects of Christians that believed that Jesus was the devil. I mean, it's really crazy how widespread and how divergent the train of thought from the initial point of when Jesus came and died to what was going on. But that's again, to take it back to Constantine, one of the main things and contributions that he did was, one, he provided that Council of Nicaea, and two, he legalized and formalized Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. Now, of course, all of this is happening and the rest of the world is still spinning. And I think one thing that a lot of people, when they consider these questions, especially in, relevance to like slavery and religion and history, we tend to take a one-track focus or a one-track look on these issues. But the rest of the world, other cultures, other peoples are happening. And right after this happened, 300 years after this happened, guess who shows up on the scene? The establishment of Islam by Muhammad in 610 AD, a little less than 300 years later. And of course, during this time, the Roman Empire collapsed. It splits. We have the Eastern Byzantine, which begot the Orthodox Church, and then we have the Western portion, or the Roman Catholic Church. And this is the time period, and I'm going over this really fast. I do encourage you to do your own research. I do encourage you to go and look up some of the things I'm talking about, because I could be missing some things, and it's all really in your own interpretation. That being said, the Roman Empire collapsed essentially in Western Europe, and it was chaos. It's the Dark Ages, sometimes referred to as medieval times. A lot of knowledge was lost, things like how to properly wash. The Visigoths and Goths invaded all of the Roman empires, and things sort of devolved for a long time, including religion. Things like being able to read and knowing what was actually going on. These are all things that happened, and then you had things like the plague coming through. But that being said, there was pretty much chaos in Europe, chaos in Christianity following the fall of the Roman Empire. And that pretty much continued until another great historical figure. I remember when I was a child, I had a history teacher who used to say this guy's name all the time. He used to call him Charlemagne. But Charlemagne the Great is known particularly because he sought to unite all the Germanic people of Europe and convert their subjects to Christianity. You have to realize when the Roman Empire collapsed, paganism, tribalism, all these folk-oriented beliefs, they all sort of went as the Germanic tribes invaded. They spread their beliefs. So what Charlemagne ended up doing was he united most of Europe, establishing a very prejudiced and long campaign against pagans and paganism. There are things like the Massacre of Verdun in 782, where he ordered the slaughter of 4,500 Saxons who were all predominantly pagan in practice. He eventually forced Saxons to convert to Christianity and declared that anyone who didn't get baptized or followed other Christian traditions, that they get murked. And in his role as like the zealous defender of Christianity, he gave money to and land to the Christian church. He protected popes militarily. And as a way to acknowledge his power again and reinforce his relationship with the church, he was also crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. I think that was in 800 AD. And that happened at St. Peter's Basilica. So that really just gives you some context as to how far back this goes. 800 years after the death of Christ, we have this guy wreaking havoc through Europe and cleaning up all the mess that the fall of the Roman Empire established. Of course, we fast forward a few more hundred years, and again, this is all very high level. Not getting too deep into it. I encourage you to do your own research. But we fast forward to 1054 AD, and now we have a new problem. Christianity has been standardized. Most of Europe is now Christian. But we still have those vestiges and those remnants of the original establishment of Christianity by Constantine when it was still the Roman emperor. And we have two competing forces within the Christian dialogue. We have, of course, the Eastern Orthodox, which is based in what was then Constantinople, but we now know today is Istanbul. Constantinople is Istanbul. Of course, and what happened was essentially we had a great schism within the Christian church, a split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church, which most of us know now as like the Catholic Church, based in Italy. Of course, there were plenty of reasons why that happened. I don't want to get too far deep into it, but needless to say that, it caused a bit of a divergence when it came to Christian cohesiveness and doctrine. And we saw that. What's funny is that schism and that break between those two sides of the church, I think they just recently, like maybe like 20 years or so ago, finally stopped excommunicating each other from their respective churches. So from 1054 to maybe like 2020, I want to say like 2001 or something like that. You can look it up, but it was only till then that this sort of schism between the churches and this animosity fully dissipated. That being said, as I said before, even with Charlemagne coming through and wreaking havoc in Europe and uniting it and Christianizing it and working as a Christianizing force, we start to see the practices evolve in Europe, the establishment of feudalism, the establishment of like the holy right to rule. And I feel like this is the beginnings of like the very first sort of reinforcement or arguments that people who are against Christianity and its role in slavery like to try and make. So I just want to address it. Feudalism, of course, is a system of governance. You have like the head, the lord, the king. Then you have various landowners or lesser nobility. Then you have, chivalric knights. And at the very bottom of that totem pole, you have what was called serfs. A lot of people like to try and equate serfs to slaves. And I can really see why it would go that way, because there are a lot of things mirrored. Serfs were attached to the land. They didn't own anything. They were pretty much forced to work as a means to work another person's land, as a means to survive and be protected. And a lot of times, all of those sort of practices that we could see now are exploitative were reinforced as sort of like divinely ordained. The same way where like the right of kings, no matter how despotic or how wrong, was somehow divinely ordained. And we see this as a theme in Christianity. And again, I feel like a distinction needs to be made between the tenets of Christianity as espoused by Jesus and the way it was expressed in the human institutions that quote unquote claim to represent him. That being said, the key tenets of feudalism were like the lord-vassal relationship, the manorial system, which you could really kind of see as a precursor to a plantation system. The hierarchy of nobility, which you can kind of see as like a hierarchy mirroring a hierarchy of like racial connotations as it evolves later through time. I don't want to get too deep into it. But of course you had things like the establishment of divine right to rule, like I alluded to before, where pretty much, and this is something I notice again with like institutionalized religion versus the actual spirit or soul of the religion, is that you can pretty much use the spirit of a religion and twist its meaning, twist its words to justify almost anything. We've seen this illustrated countless times throughout history. And a lot of times people like to point to that as like the smoking gun of Christianity is bad and Christianity is this, or this religion is bad. Because again, I'm not picking on Christianity. We're just covering it in this instance. But the same thing could be pointed to almost any other religion. Any other means of controlling people or dictating people's actions can always be twisted. And I think that's something we need to address. But again, getting back to the history of everything, of course, we have the Middle Ages. And again, back in 610, remember what I said, we did have the establishment of Islam. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the history of Islam. I think I'm going to save that for another video. It is very complex and interesting. And despite the fact that I espouse myself as a Christian believer, I think it's really worth noting the historical context of Islam and the way that these two religions sort of iron sharpened iron each other throughout history. Of course, you have things like the Crusades, which occurred, very interesting period in time. It did a lot to shape views on both the Islamic side and the Christian side. And if anything, I feel like it was a very, very corrupting influence. Those sort of conflicts were a very corrupting influence on the salient values that Jesus was expounding. Of course, again, institutions, individuals, where, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I do feel like during these times, given the barbaric nature of the times, self-interest was a factor. Altruism and truth wasn't always the priority. Survival was. And I feel like that definitely bears some notation within the context of the relation between those religions, and even as we flow down again through to slavery. That being said, going back to Islam, you had the establishment of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, the Umayyad Caliphate was either the second or the third, I believe, real Islamic empire. And the only reason I'm bringing up in this instance is it was established in 661 in Damascus. But if you look at maps of it, it actually at its height stretched all the way across North Africa, all the way up into what is modern day Spain. And I find that very interesting. A lot of people, a lot of Black identity politicians and stuff, they want to identify themselves as Moors or sovereign citizens because they consider themselves Moorish, when the true historical context of a Moorish individual were people who were part of the Islamic State, the Umayyad Islamic State during this time period. Those were the Black people in Europe at the time. Those were the I won't even say Black because it was a diaspora. There were Arabians, there were Saharan Africans, some sub-Saharan Africans. And this is where you really start to see the intersection between Europe and Africa. Of course, there had always been a relationship. You can look back to Carthage and things of that nature. But this is, as we move closer to modern day, this is where we start to see a bit of an intersection. Now, of course, the Umayyad Caliphate wasn't the only caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate did eventually overthrow the Umayyad Caliphate. But prior to that happening, the Umayyad dynasty actually established what is called the Cordoba Caliphate, or the Caliphate of Cordoba. And anybody who knows geography, a little bit of European geography, knows that Cordoba is in Spain. So taking that into context, we have essentially what are a colored people, whether or not you want to call them Black, African, what essentially is a foreign element inside of Europe establishing a kingdom. And a lot of people like to say, oh, the Arabs taught Europe. The Arabs taught Europe a lot during this time. Breakthroughs in medicine, breakthroughs in the institution of universities and hospitals. They had lit cities. The advancements that the Moors introduced to a section of what was mostly Christian Europe at this time really can't be overstated, the impact that they had. However, that being said, they didn't like it. The Europeans didn't like it. They didn't like it, one, because these people weren't Christian, and two, because they were part of a foreign element. And despite it lasting for hundreds of years, eventually the Spaniards and other elements of Europe, they were like, hey, we got to kick these fools out. We got to get these Arabs, these Muslims, I guess hearkening back to the spirit of Charlemagne. They were like, hey, if you ain't Christian, you can't be up in here, despite the fact that you're teaching us all this stuff so that, we're not having barbers do surgery and we're washing properly. We're going to ignore all that because you don't believe the same God we do. And that pretty much led to a period called the Reconquista, or the removal of the Moors from Spain and Portugal. Now, I know this is like a really long, drawn-out history lesson. Nobody's like, oh, this is so boring. But the reason I took such a long roundabout way to get there is because now we're about to move into the period of history where we're moving into the Americas. The Reconquista essentially took about 300 years. You had battles in 1212, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, where the Castilian forces, supported by Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, defeated the Almohads, removing at least the last significant Islamic threat to Christian rule in Spain. That's in 1221, right? And of course, the the kingdoms of Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, and Castilian. Those are all names that should sort of click for you as far as like those were different houses in Spain. There are cities still named after them, Castile, things of that nature. Now, of course, the conflicts continued until we come down to Ferdinand III, the King of Castile and Leon, who did play a pivotal role in the later stages of the Reconquista. Because like it wasn't like a one battle and it's done. You know, these people were entrenched. They were part of the land. And I really would liken it akin to a genocide or mass deportation that we want to characterize on people like Stalin and things of that. Of course, we don't hit it as hard because it's a little bit further back in antiquity. But, you know, this was a concerted effort to move and extinguish a people in a particular land. And it was eventually successful. What I find really interesting, though, and what brings it back to our discussion about Christianity and slavery, is, of course, all of these people were being ordained and condoned by the Catholic Church. It was. I'm not saying whether it was right or wrong. It's just a historical fact that we have to acknowledge and take into approximation. And what I find exceedingly interesting is that at the end of the Reconquista, and what brings it to the Americas and moving towards the triangle slave trade, is once Portugal and the Spanish kings had established and kicked out the Moors, now they started to fight amongst themselves. They started to fight amongst themselves for resources. They started to fight amongst themselves for land. And there began to become a conflict in particular between Portugal and Spain. African Spain's in Portugal prior to 1441. And I know how you see we're getting close to a magic date, but I'll save that for later. But African slaves in Portugal prior to 1441 were predominantly Berbers and Arabs from the North African Barbary coast. They were Moors. They were typically enslaved during the wars of conquest during the Reconquista, and the conflicts between the Christian and Islamic kingdoms. The first expeditions to sub-Saharan Africa were set out by Prince Infante de Henrique. This guy is really famous. You may or may not have heard of him in your world history class, but sometimes he's called Henry the Navigator. And he went on an exploration with an intent to probe how far the kingdoms of the Moors or the Muslims went down deep into Africa, because they didn't really have an understanding of sub-Saharan Africa. They really had only been dealing with the coast. He goes down, he has expeditions, and he comes back with African slaves as a way to compensate for the expenses of the voyage. Now, the enslavement of these Africans was seen as a military campaign because the people that the Portuguese encountered were identified as Moorish. And thus, them being Moorish, they were associated with Islam. It really is interesting to note that these slaves at this time, and the predominant practice during this time, wasn't to enslave a person because of their race per se. It was more a religious-based thing. And that went both ways. I believe there are tenets in Islam as well that sort of supported the same sort of perspective. Like, you know, we're going to enslave the other group. And I think it's interesting in that the Pope during this time really reinforced these thoughts. Like I said, 1441 was when Henry decided to make that journey. I believe Prince Henry, or Henry the Navigator, he began selling African slaves in Lagos around 1444. In 1445, Pope Nicholas V gave Portugal the rights to continue the slave trade in West Africa under one provision. And this is what I find really interesting. The Pope said, hey, you can keep taking slaves, but you have to turn them into Christians. So this is where we first see the introduction of narrative, or the introduction of the narrative that slavery was a Christianizing and a civilizing force, as enforced by the head of the Catholic Church, or the head of the only real church at this time. There hadn't been Protestantism created or anything like that, which is really, really interesting. Now, all slaves and goods brought back to Portugal at this time were subject to duties and tariffs, but uniquely enough, slaves were baptized before they were allowed to be shipped. Because again, because of this papal bull, because of this direction from the church, it was morally wrong to take a slave and not turn them into a Christian, which I think you see how big a divergence that is from the tenets of Jesus and the tenets of Christianity versus it being a product of the political and historical context of the times. Again, a lot of people like to conflate the two, but I ultimately think that's destructive to having a real understanding of what's going on. Now, the process of enslavement, which was viewed by a lot of people as being cruel, was justified through Christianity as a Christianizing effect. And given that there was a high demand for slaves in Portugal due to a shortage of laborers, black slaves were in really, really high demand. And notice I said black instead of Moorish, because he did journey beyond the Moorish sphere of influence down to present-day Lagos or Nigeria. And the one reason that they found that black slaves were more appealing than Moors or followers of Islam is they were easier to convert. They would have to travel twice as far to get to a sphere of influence where they would be protected and accepted. They would have to make it through the Islamic sort of barrier on the northern coast before they could get home. So that's what really facilitated, hey, rather than continuing to just capture Muslims, let's go a little bit further south to Lagos and begin a slave trade there. And like I said, I find that extremely interesting because, again, you see that this isn't necessarily being motivated by Christianity in and of itself, but by the historical context, the economic context, and the social context of the time. So again, a lot of people like to try and make the argument that, hey, Christianity did this, and I would make the argument that, hey, people did this. They may have been Christian or may have been expounding themselves as Christian, but their actions weren't motivated by any Christian ethic or Christian understanding. It was just a product of the times, a product of, if you look back at our old video, the zeitgeist of the time. That being said, moving forward a little bit, in 1452, Pope Nicholas IV, or fifth rather, authorized Alfonso V of Portugal to conquer Saracens, pagans, and consign them to perpetual servitude. This is, again, like I said, the beginnings of just establishing the brickworks that would eventually become the triangle slave trade. We know now today that a good, 3/4 of slaves that were sent to the Americas came from Western Africa, around the Nigerian region. The first leg of that, the Europe connection to this, happened with Henry the Navigator and going down there to Lagos and saying, hey, it's easier for us to capture black slaves rather than Moorish Islam following slaves and use them. Now, of course, we haven't even made it to where we want to be. This is still predominantly in the old world. They didn't know a whole lot about Africa, but they had been having interactions for hundreds of years. Nothing new introduced. The first leg of the triangle slave trade has been introduced. Now, again, we have a conflict for these resources, for these slaves, between the kingdoms in Spain and Portugal. And you see sort of a power struggle between them because at the time, a lot of power that you got as a king came from the Pope. Your divine right. You had to be ordained. These kings at these times were being crowned by bishops. It legitimized them and gave them power. So when they came into conflicts, what happened during this time period a lot of times is these conflicts would be put before the Pope. Of course, I would kind of make it akin to the United Nations of the time. Now, the Pope may not militarily have the resources to back up and do whatever it is that he says, but the legitimizing effect of his word, or the legitimizing and show of his direction, did a whole lot politically for an individual at this time, particularly rulers. So moving forward a little bit further, we have, of course, the Catholic King of Portugal, the Catholic King of Spain coming into conflict, fighting over resources, fighting over these new lands that they're finally coming into fruition with. And of course, we're at the tail end of the Reconquista, where they're pushing out all the Moors. And what's funny enough is that the Reconquista essentially concluded by the end of the 13th century. What else happened at the end of the 13th century? We see a consolidation of the Christian territories in Spain through the marriage of, and these are real buzzword names that everybody should know, the marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile in 1469. That united the Spanish crown, and the Catholic monarchs completed the conquest of Granada in 1492. Granada was one of the last strongholds of the Moorish kingdoms inside of the Iberian Peninsula or Spain. Now, 1492. What else happened in 1492, guys? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella. So you see how we're starting to move into some more historical context that you might be a little bit more familiar with. So this pivotal point in history marked not only the end of Muslim rule in Spain, but also it continued to lay the groundwork for subsequent Spanish emphasis on religious uniformity and spread of its influence into colonialism. Now, of course, we have the voyage in 1492, and right after 1492, when Columbus did find out everything that was going on and made it to the Americas, there was a papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI called the Antikythera papal bull. This granted the Catholic monarchs, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, the people who just found the Americas, all lands to the west and south, pole to pole, 100 leagues west and south of any islands of the Azores or Cape Verde Islands. Now, the Azores are a cluster of islands off the coast of Africa. So essentially what this did was the Pope said, hey, Spain, since you and Portugal are arguing and you're having issues and you're both Christians and we want to work this out, since you bribed me, because that's probably what happened, since you bribed me or performed some service, I'm going to say, Spain, any land that's found west of the Azores, and I find the fact that the Azores were noted because I believe it was Henry the Navigator from Portugal who actually discovered or quote-unquote found the Azore Islands. Any lands west of that, you can rule. And now we start to see how, okay, so that's how Spain got influence in the Americas. That's why Spain was such a big player in the Americas. Now, again, all of this is coming on the tail of Columbus's voyage and quote-unquote discovery of the Americas. Now, when Columbus got there, there's a reason why it's Native Americans Day now instead of Columbus Day, because this guy was a bit of a scumbag. There are stories from biblical friars, or Catholic friars and monks who are witnessing the travesties and the injustices and the savagery that Columbus and the rest of the people who were showing up in the Americas were perpetrating on the indigenous population. They're cutting off hands if you didn't bring enough gold. They were killing babies. There was wanton rape and murder and slaughter. And during that time, it was largely justified because it was the position of a lot of people that these people didn't have souls. They weren't Christian, and they were akin to animals. So this sort of exploitation and abuse was okay. And with that, they had established what essentially is called the encomienda system. That was a system in which it was essentially a sort of slavery, except instead of it being like one person owning another person, it was more in a colonial sense where the Europeans were co-opting entire groups of indigenous peoples for quote-unquote public works, and really working them to death. These public works were mostly like mining, building of infrastructure, things of that nature. And like I referred to before, a lot of this stuff was being seen by Christian monks, and just as many monks who, were like, hey, they don't have souls, it's okay. There were quite a few monks who were like, hey, this is pretty messed up, guys. Like, this is not God. This is not Jesus. And those monks ran their way all the way back to Rome, and pretty much started snitching on what these people were doing. So with that, we had the institution of what are called the New Laws of 1542. They're also called the Laws of the Indies for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians. These set regulations issued by King Charles I of Spain, also known as Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Again, that title pops up because he was the favorite one of the Catholic Church, in response to concerns about the mistreatment that these monks and stuff were coming back and reporting. So the new laws aim to protect the rights of indigenous populations by establishing guidelines to their treatment, regulating the behavior of the Spanish colonizers, because they were turning up. They really did not give a F. about what was going on. It reformed the encomienda system. It still allowed Spanish colonists to exploit the labor of indigenous people, but it was significantly restricted, and it sought to curb the abuse that the indigenous laborers were experiencing, and the power of the encomenderos, or the lords of this newly discovered land and colonies. It sought to curb their abuses and the powers of things that they could do. It established the repartimento system, which was sort of the second coming of the encomienda system, which aimed to organize and regulate the forced labor that was being perpetrated on the indigenous populations. And it provided a set number of labors for public projects. While it was intended to, prevent exploitation, really it just normally led to more abuses. So it was like well-intentioned, but given the distance, the efficacy and the enforceability of these reforms that these high-minded individuals all the way back in Europe were trying to put on these savages, and by savages I mean the Europeans in the Americas, not the indigenous peoples. It really didn't do a lot to curb the bloodthirsty nature of the exploitation that they were perpetrating. So of course, like I said, that was 1542. Another few years, we have other players coming into the Americas. We have France. We have the establishment of the American colonies. Of course, we have the 1619 landing, which is after the founding of Jamestown in 1607. So 1607, the founding of Jamestown, England shows up on the scene. And then we have the 1619 landing. And of course, 1619, if you're versed in pretty much African Americans' roles in the United States, we recognize that from things like the 1619 Project, which was the impetus behind CRT, or critical race theory. And that really refers to the landing in late August of 1619 of 20 to 30 Africans that landed at Point Comfort, or today's Fort Monroe, in Hampton, Virginia. These people were the first recorded instances of African slaves being brought to the American colonies, which is a very pivotal moment in history. And what I find interesting about it is that they were brought to the American colonies by a privateer ship, the White Lion. Now, I know you're wondering, it's a privateer ship, why are they carrying slaves? Well, funnily enough, the groups that were brought to be slaves in the English colonies had been captured from a Spanish slave ship, the San Juan Batista. So you already see how, remember all the way back when we were talking about the Portuguese and the Spanish finally figuring out it's easier to enslave people from further south than the Moorish sphere of influence? One of those ships got captured by an English privateer, and they were like, hey, we got some slaves, might as well bring them to Virginia. So now we have the second leg of that triangle slave trade, really the second and third. And all the while, this is being condoned by the Catholic Church. The only reason that that institution or that line or that particular segment of the triangle slave trade came into existence was through the blessing, through papal bulls from the Pope, which I find vastly very interesting. It's really kind of mind-blowing to see how, again, not the religion itself, but the political factors in the human institutions that are purporting to represent this religion, how they, through historical context, through social context, through economic context, pretty much facilitated and invested in the growth of this barbaric practice of slavery, particularly moving through to the 18th century slavery or 19th century slavery. We see why the paradigm of black people being slaves in America did, in a way, come on the heels of pretty much Catholic decisions and European decisions, which is, at that point, undisputable. Now, of course, we've established how slaves got to America. We've established the historical context of slavery all the way back to antiquity, from the Roman Empire, from when Jesus was born, through to Charlemagne and Constantine, through to the establishment of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, all the way through to the dissolution of the Umayyad Caliphate and the Cordoba Caliphate. all the way through from there to the proliferation of getting slaves from Central Africa or Western Africa, all the way through to them being brought to the Americas. I feel like a lot of people, without taking this historical context, again, want to lay this paradigm at the feet of Christianity itself. And I think that's just a logical fallacy. These things happen not because of the religion, but because of the people. And that's something that I feel like a lot of people need to take into context. And I know the next, I already hear it coming from a lot of my black identity politics individuals who are throwing out, hey, Christianity was used to justify slavery to the slaves after this paradigm was set up and the slaves got here, and they only wanted to make you Christian so they could control you. And to that, I would say, yeah, they did. They definitely did proliferate. And that goes back to the papal bulls where they were saying, oh, this is a Christianizing and a civilizing influence or a practice. But what you also have to recognize, again, is that's not necessarily representative of the religion, but of those institutions, those groups of people in their desires for power and influence. And that goes all the way back to Charlemagne. I mean, who's to say that Charlemagne didn't do it, conquer most of Europe and convert most of the pagans in Europe because it was easier and a more thorough line to power. Who's to say that the reason Constantine converted on his deathbed and made things legal is because it was simpler and it would allow him to have more power? Who's to say that Christianity wasn't in effect reinforced by most of the kingdoms in Europe because it was used as a way to give themselves divine right to rule? What we have to recognize, and again, what I'm trying to really reinforce with this, because this isn't a slam piece on Christianity at all. It's really a slam piece on human nature. And I feel like a lot of people, through their own trauma or issues with the church, often try to lay the faults in human nature at the feet of Christianity. And again, I say that's a bit of a fallacy. It was definitely used. There were things like the Slave Bible of 1807 that was given to a lot of slaves in the Americas. And about 90% of the Old Testament is missing from that text. 50% of the New Testament is missing from that Slave Bible. So the Christianity that was being taught to the slaves wasn't even the real Christianity. It was a watered down version to maintain control as represented and as purported by people who wanted to establish power and governance over their slaves. Very sort of touchy subject, very sort of, nuanced sort of understanding when it comes to these things. But that's what's really crazy about existence is most things are nuanced, most things are complex, and most things require post-text, pretext, subtext in order to get the real context. So I would encourage, again, I'm not out here trying to convert anybody. I'm not out here trying to tell you what to think or how to think about Christianity as a whole. I would just encourage you, as I do with every Stateless Shinobi podcast, is to just expand your perception a little bit. Look at things objectively. Try and take it for the sum of its parts. See the forest and the trees. And what I've noticed and what I'm trying to teach everybody who watches the Stateless Shinobi podcast is when you do that, you become more empowered and more knowledgeable. And with that, like I said, again, I love being able to do this for you guys. I want to continue to do this. We got some great topics coming up. I really do think I'm going to do another 2 or 3 parts just to break this down a little bit more. I recognize it is a bit of a long ride, and I do drone on a bit. Give me some context or some jokes in the comment section if you guys want to see me switch it up or lighten things a tad. But that being said, go ahead and hit that like button for me. It really helps the channel out. I want to be able to keep pumping this information out to you guys. Give us a follow, share it to your friends, and have a debate. If you have an individual in your circle or in your friendship or in your family who's just really turned away from Christianity and sees it as this big evil thing, let them watch this video. Let them gain a little bit more perspective, and you guys have a discussion. It doesn't have to be an argument. It doesn't have to be conflict. It could just be you guys both questioning each other. Iron sharpens iron, and gaining a better understanding of the holistic issue. Again, like I said, it is a very sensitive topic when you talk about religion and something as sore to a lot of individuals as institutional slavery. But again, this is the type of channel we have here. I don't want to shy away from the tough topics. I want us to really dive into them, because it's only through these uncomfortable conversations that we get to any real level of understanding. So that being said, this is the Stateless Shinobi Podcast. I love your faces. I want to see more of you. Go ahead and like, share, subscribe. Really share, though, because we need more followers. And I will see you at the next episode. God bless.